But with throwing programs that are traditional and available right now, they make a mistake that both volume, the number of throws, and intensity, the effort of throws, are going up linearly.
Hey, this is More Than Velocity with Ryan Croton and Jordan Oseguera. I am Bart Pear, and today we are going to continue our workload monitoring that we were talking about. We did some pitching count guidelines in the last podcast, talking about in season, and now we want to focus on off season and what kind of program makes sense for the off season and what that looks like. And really get into the details of that so you know how to best prepare yourself for the rest of the year when you need to be ready. So, Ryan, I know this is and this is something that's going to be available on our site and through some of the courses that we do and stuff. But this is definitely something I think you guys should check out, and I'll put some links once it's ready in the notes here. But let's talk about the off season, Ryan.
Sure. So, the off season it's a time in which the body recuperates, but you're also training the body. So, athletes who are playing this game of baseball, they should be on some type of strength and conditioning program and an off season throwing program. And those two things, they work together. The biggest thing in developing your off season throwing program is knowing the end date, because whatever the end date is, you should be working back 14 to 16 weeks in progressing your throwing plan. That just gives the opportunity to not have a quick spike in workload. And, just as an overview of throwing programs in general, people have adapted their throwing programs from rehabilitation, and it doesn't make sense. So, for example, in training, there is this relationship where if you increase intensity, you lower volume. So that means when you increase the effort of throwing, you actually throw less. Or there are wave-loaded patterns where you just have periods of very high intensity, high volume, and periods of very low intensity, low volume. But with throwing programs that are traditional and available right now, they make a mistake that both volume, the number of throws, and intensity, the effort of throws, are going up linearly. So there's not a great opportunity to progress the throwing program with some deloading and some other aspects that are important for just health in general. So those are the two elements, I think, before we get into the specific ones that I wanted to talk about, is that, the current state of throwing programs, they're not planned very well. The ramp up is too significant, and people don't give themselves enough time.
Great. So before we get into the details, let's just talk about how important an off season is, why you need to have one, and in real general what it should look like. You were talking about strength and conditioning and some other things. So and I maybe Jordan can jump in there too. Just in terms of why an off season is important.
Yeah. Before I kind of let Ryan dive into the next part there, just on the state of the throwing programs of it. One of my big complaints, whether it's in high school, college, pro ball, no matter what your level of play is the throwing program, like Ryan said, they're adapted from a rehab model. So they're already assuming that every player's going into the off season just injured and wounded when it comes down to it, when you adapt one of those throwing programs. And not every player needs a rehab program. Some of them need a quick recovery period, and then they got to start building up. You got to build that endurance, you got to build that strength, you got to build those throwing volumes. And the big word right now is acute to chronic ratio. The assumption that it's always going to be a linear pattern, like Ryan was saying, is not the greatest way to approach an off season for a healthy, ready to go pitcher. You got to have a different way to look at things. And obviously, the way that things have been going now have not been lowering injuries. Although there's way more information out there on what guys should be doing, if that makes sense.
So, and obviously, one of the ways to know where you're sitting as you finish your season is using the Arm Care app, and it'll tell you, and it has an off-season phase to it as well, and it adapts the programming around that. But it'll give you a really good idea of where you are. Obviously, if you're injured, you're injured. But in terms of how much recovery you need and when you're going to be ready to really start pushing some strength again, the app's a good guide for that.
Yeah, just to give some clarity on that, because I've had a lot of phone calls from people that didn't realize there's different sections you can put in on the app itself for where you're at in the season. People weren't aware there's a preseason, in season, and an off season, and once they started understanding that, it opened up their eyes to how much variation there is in the training through this as well. So you just brought that up. I know we're not talking about that, but anyone listening, to give clarity in the settings, make sure you're clicking that information so you're in the right season of where you're competing at.
Absolutely. So there should be some time where you're not throwing at all. How do we gauge how much time that should be, and what's the goal of that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to look at your competitive metrics. So I think, Jordan and I had talked about, if you got a pitcher that's throwing 80 innings, whatever you would consider, high for that athlete, and the athlete could ask the coach, how often was I used, and also listening to the way that their body feels. It gives you the first initial phase of no throwing. We do recommend there's a phase of no throwing from 2 to 4 weeks. 2 on the low end if, the athlete didn't have as much of an intense competitive season, and 4 weeks, if they have. And so, the statistics, they matter. And I think athletes and parents and coaches should be aware and giving those details. So, if I'm a player that played 80 games as a college player, that's a lot of games that, I might want to just give myself some recovery of 4 weeks per se. But during the recovery period where there's no throwing, they still need to maintain their arm care training. They still have to continually build their scapular stabilizers, their rotator cuff, make sure that they have appropriate mobility before entering back into the first phase of throwing.
Explain the first phase of throwing. What does that mean?
So the first phase, so this is an activation phase. We call it activation. And in activation, the athlete is throwing up to 90 feet. And the intensity level should be between a 5 or 6 out of 10 effort. So it's essentially, you're doing this 3 times a week. So you have a lot of recovery days in between. You're still giving the opportunity for the body to recover, but you're building back range of motion. You're building back the coordination of throwing. And you can utilize this activation throwing, so to get used to it, for points in the season where you want to deload. And we can talk about that later, but it's important to really get a grasp of what does activation mean, because you can insert these activation days of 90-foot throws, 5 to 6 out of 10 effort, to give the body an opportunity to recover while you're still throwing. But we use this in the initial phase, and that lasts for about 2 weeks.
And so this is the transition from not throwing at all into obviously throwing, and you were calling it activation, and then we run into an elongation phase next. And what's the goal behind that phase?
Yeah, so in elongation, you're working back systematically until that you reach your maximum limit, and it happens over a series of weeks. For position players, they have to throw at further distances for a longer period of time, so they have a division of moderate elongation, which is from 90 to 150 feet focus. And then they go to maximum elongation for 4 weeks, which is, going from past 150 feet. But the pitchers, it's kind of blocked together because they need to get to their bullpens, which is a different feature of their phases. So, elongation is just as it is. We're building back distance, and that's going to increase range of motion. What people might not know is that over 180 feet throwing maximally, it increases loads by 10% versus the mound for pitching. So the way that it has to be strategized is what we talked about is the rehab model is throw more, throw harder, throw with more intensity. So you're getting as long as you can and you're throwing more throws. In the phase of elongation, you may need to put in an activation day. It might make sense to put in an activation day on a Thursday or a Friday before the weekend to say, okay, I've thrown 3 times, pretty much at close to my max distance. I need to have a deload day where I'm throwing, but I'm giving myself some recovery. And that allows the body to really regenerate. So that's, what we mean by elongation.
And so that prepares them for bullpens, and you've got it broken out into actually pitches as well. So you want to go into the detail of that?
Yeah. So when we get to the bullpen session, and I think one note I want to make on the bullpen section for pitching, there's an athlete that wants to do a velocity enhancement program, and they check out on our velocity checklist, and they're monitoring their strength and range of motion. They need to have a couple bullpens, at least a week of bullpens, 2 in a week, that they can participate in before they're ready. And another thing about bullpens is the athlete has to schedule 72 hours rest between them. They need a lot of recovery. So most programs I see a lot in pro ball, they do every other day bullpens. And that's a lot. That doesn't give a ton of recovery for the throwing arm. And when I was with the Angels, we sent out a survey to determine when the athlete's arm felt best. And a lot of the athletes within 48 hours, they still felt pain. They still felt soreness at the beginning of the season. So, you need to spread that to 72 hours. So a Tuesday and Friday bullpen makes sense. And you start with the intro to bullpen when we talk about pitches, to start with 15 pitches, and generally all fastballs, to get the arm ready again.
So, and the download we have, this is primarily at least the distances and the recovery dates. This is collegiate and pro. Would you change it for high school? Is there anything we'd modify?
I'd kind of lean on Jordan there. For me, I wouldn't, because I think it's pretty well structured. But they may go from two bullpens in a week, Tuesday and Friday, to one potentially, if they had like a Tuesday bullpen, and we have Wednesdays off during this period, so they get a recovery day, and then they build up Thursday, and then they throw again their bullpen on Friday. So I don't know, Jordan, how do you feel about high schoolers?
I mean, I agree. My big complaint with high school is they normally are coming right out of, for instance, whether it's basketball, wrestling, depending on your state, some of it's coming right out of football. So they haven't had that acclimation to build up. So long as they're working back and they're giving themselves time to get acclimated, they're good to go. But for me, the big issue with high school is most of the time they're coming right out of basketball season. They haven't thrown, and then they're just expected to hit these max workloads without that proper kind of ramp up phase.
So let's talk about off-season versus preseason, and these different age groups and how that fits in, so that if maybe I'm a parent, what does that mean? We're in off-season. Do we have enough time for an off-season? How do I fit all this in?
Yeah, I mean, it takes some planning to prepare for baseball. I mean, the athlete needs to be on a strength and conditioning plan, and a higher level athlete, let's just start there. They would probably do an upper lower body split. So that means they would do an upper body lift, let's say Monday, and a lower body lift Tuesday, and Wednesday would be off or a recovery day. And then they would have an upper or lower again on Thursday and then Friday. So they'd be training 4 days a week. But and that would be in the off season. Getting towards the preseason, you either continue that schedule and shorten the lifts, you do less work because now you need to do baseball related stuff. They might be fielding, or they might be throwing bullpens, they might be doing these things. Or for your younger athletes, they may be fine doing a 3-day a week program that's more total body. They do a Monday, they do a Wednesday, they do a Friday, and they fit their throwing in between. Now, I was a multi-sport athlete, and I made sure In the winter, I went somewhere indoors to throw after school, and it wasn't very long. I probably would only throw for about half an hour, like the whole thing with a warm up and a throw. Athletes that are in warmer climates, it's a little easier. They don't have to go to an indoor facility, but you have to be scheduled. That's kind of the main thing, is that athletes, they need a schedule. They need to understand where they have to be. And, if I have basketball practice in the morning at, 7, and then I might have a game that day, and usually our games are at like 2:00. After school, I'd do a little homework, eat dinner, and then I would go and throw, or I'd go and lift. But it's a commitment. If they want to stay healthy, and they want to be able to have the greatest opportunity, they have to be able to have the commitment while they're still playing multiple sports.
Jordan, you got anything there?
I agree. I can't add. So,
all right. So, if let's say I'm a collegiate player, I'm looking. I grab this. What do I do? I mean, walk me through. Let's say what target date am I picking? I'm picking to work backwards. So the day that I'm showing up at, the collegiate facility, what date am I starting? Is it opening day? What am I starting at to work backwards to figure out the time frames for this?
Yeah, Jordan, Jordan's been in college.
So what I would always do for my guys is, for my first starter, second starter, and third starter, I would just work back from, like Bart said, opening day. I want those guys ready to go, and I would work backwards from there. I'd find out where I'm going to be at in the season. The caveat with college is you need to understand when those guys are ending their summer ball season, how many innings they pitch from there. And, for instance, if I had a guy that started, roughly the school year is about 28 to 32 weeks, depending on, your division, if they're doing trimesters, semesters, things like that. So we had a guy who threw something like 110 innings for us. In the season, we'll just say it was, to make things easy, we'll say it was 2021. He threw 110 innings for us, and then he pitched, 45 innings in one of the collegiate leagues. So he had a heavy workload. So that guy, we programmed in 4 weeks of no throw, but we did a lot of training. As soon as he got back on campus, we had 4 weeks of him not throwing, heavy arm care work, heavy foundational fitness work, really building that out. And then from there, we worked back that 14 to 16 weeks to make sure he's going to be ready to go for opening day. So we know when opening day is, and we knew when he needed to start facing hitters, obviously using a very similar template to what Ryan's put together. And we just worked backwards from that point. And then once you know when the start date is, and you know when their end date is of summer ball, you can fill the gaps in extremely easy in between based on the context of your setting, especially at the collegiate level.
How does it vary at other levels? Similar concept? You're just dealing with more or less time?
Similar concept, and I think Ryan kind of alluded to it, pretty well, that at the high school level specifically, it gets really hard because if a player's, multiple sports, you have to find time. You obviously need to be eligible. You have to put effort into schoolwork as well. You got to find time in your day to do some type of activation, keep your arm going, and do whatever you can, really. The one that usually works out pretty well, surprisingly, is quarterbacks. They're usually throwing a different implement with, 1 pound football, a little over a pound, whatever that exact weight is, but they're keeping their arm active with, easy throws, high intensity throws. They usually get back into the baseball season a lot better than the guy who's playing basketball because they're keeping their arm active. So anything you can do to know when that start date is and work backwards is going to help you out. And then obviously communicate, and communicate. If if your main priority is baseball and you're playing basketball, communicate with the basketball coach to see if he's good with you sticking around in the gym for an extra 15 minutes after practice to get a little work in. Whatever it may be, if you communicate, most coaches are going to help you out.
Awesome. Definitely download, check this out. Ryan, anything to say to wrap this up?
Yeah, no, I mean, we can't stress it enough too. If in this off season, if you're feeling discomfort at all, it's important that you get that checked out. I can't stress it enough that you should not be throwing through pain. That's just kind of a cardinal rule that we have. And if it lasts longer than 48 hours and it doesn't resolve when you're warmed up, it's time to get it medically checked, because you can make it worse, and there's no sense of being injured in the off season. It's really upsetting when that happens at any level.
Absolutely. All right. Until next time.